shalom, ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Ya'aseh shalom, ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Ya'aseh shalom, ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Shalom bimromah, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Beinu ginu amen. Oseh shalom bimromah, ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Beinu ginu amen. Ya'aseh shalom, ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Ya'aseh shalom, ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Ya'aseh shalom, ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Ya'aseh shalom, ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Ya'aseh shalom, ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael.
You're at 40.
We're waiting for more people. Well, people have things to do. Sunday night.
All right, welcome everyone. Thanks very much for coming. I hope you can hear me well. My name is Phil David. I'm the Executive Director of Adath Israel, and we're actually at Adath Israel tonight, socially distanced in a couple of different rooms. We're very happy to have Gilbert Sharpe here tonight, along with Dr. Cliff Posel and Rabbi David Seed. In the background to all of this is our genius, Sarah McGoldrick, who will be helping us with all the technology. I'm just going to quickly introduce Dr. Cliff Posel, who's a member of our synagogue, and his wife, Bonnie, is a member of our board. Cliff is a native Montrealer, and after graduating from McGill Medical School, completed his psychiatric residency here in Toronto, currently a staff psychiatrist in the Division of General Psychiatry at Sunnybrook, and an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. So Cliff is going to be playing a big role tonight in moderating the session once Gilbert Sharpe finishes his presentation. But for now, what I'd like to do is turn it over to Rabbi C to do an introduction.
Thank you, Phil. And thank you everyone for being here this evening. I've been looking forward to this evening with great anticipation because of my own concern for people's well-being. As we know in our prayers, when we hope for people's well-being, from Misha Berach, we talk about refuat hanefesh, refuat haguf, the healing of spirit and also of body. And we've had several doctors come on the adult education series, talk about the physical aspects of what we are dealing with during this challenging time. But the spirit, our mental well-being, is something that is of equal concern, certainly within our tradition and in our synagogue. We, the entire clergy, the staff, are here for you and have been trying to reach out to deal with your emotional well-being. But this evening we have a true expert who is here, and it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce our speaker this evening, our member, Gilbert Sharpe. Gilbert Sharpe advises on a wide range of health law and policy matters involving healthcare. He is the former director of the legal branch of the Ontario Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, and has worked both with numerous ministries of the Ontario government and federal agencies. Additionally, Mr. Sharpe has been an advisor on international projects in numerous countries, including consultations to the US on healthcare reforms under both the Clinton and Obama administrations. Mr. Sharpe is an author and professor in the Faculty of Law at U of T, and it is my pleasure to welcome Gilbert Sharpe with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here at Adath Israel and to be able to chat with you tonight. It is a very difficult topic, always has been, but more so now with the incredible anxiety and stress that people are feeling, having been shut in for so long. The area of mental health, when I first approached it after teaching for a number of years and joined the government in the mid-70s, is, as we know, quite different than breaking a leg and having a cast and having it heal. The mind, of course, is usually not so resilient. And the notion of writing a law that would both respect individual rights, but also reflect on the concerns and needs of society in circumstances where people can be put away against their will. When we think about it, what other circumstances are there? Criminal law, of course, comes to mind immediately. So when I began my work in the government and I looked into the history of mental health, and a very interesting evolution came to mind. And I wanted to share some of that history with you. I wanted to say to you that I see this as an interactive opportunity that doesn't necessarily tonight have to end at 8. And certainly as a member of the shul, I want to let everyone know I'm available as a resource on an ongoing basis if you see it as potentially useful. So the idea of our mental hospitals, historically, the term asylum comes to mind, a place of security. And when I started originally advising the then government mental hospitals, there were a dozen of them, it was described to me that there was this custom of guesting. And I said, guesting, what does that mean? Well, it means if someone is wandering through a town of Whitby or Kingston where there were psychiatric hospitals at night and had nowhere to stay, they could knock on the door of the local mental hospital and they would be given a bed for the night, not as a patient, not admitted, but a place of security. That is some of the history. Pre-1968, the legislation that applied was the Mental Hospitals Act. And civil committal was based on mental illness and 2 physicians indicating that the person needed to be in hospital. Once in as an involuntary patient, the patient no longer had the ability to do certain things. They could not refuse treatment. They couldn't manage their assets. The public trustee would take over. They couldn't even vote in elections. The Ontario and the Federal Election Acts precluded prisoners and patients in psychiatric hospitals from voting. And there were no review boards. There were no formal mechanisms for patients short of habeas corpus to appeal and get out once they were confined. I was quite taken back as a young lawyer to find operating rooms in our mental hospitals where psychosurgery was performed quite routinely. However, when one looked to the other side and patients were ultimately released into the community, it was a gradual release. The hospitals maintained responsibility and accountability for the individual. There is a program that is still around, although not in the same legal format, called Homes for Special Care. And they were often discharged into these places of security in the community while their bed was kept for them in the hospital, and they were closely monitored and provided with outpatient care while they were out. We had very large hospitals in those days. Queen Street Mental Health Center had 1,000 inpatients, and there were back wards. But as psychiatrists and others will know now, with the discovery of psychotropic drugs, patients were able to be released much sooner into the community. And that did happen. And there was a proliferation of psychiatric units in public hospitals, which had not existed to any great extent historically. In 1968, the Mental Health Act in Ontario first appeared, and it changed the committal standard where one doctor could commit, and it didn't have to be a psychiatrist, it could be a general practitioner, based on the person being mentally ill and a safety risk to themselves or others. Review boards were added. There was nothing said about treatment. The authority for the person in the hospital was simply to be detained. So from my perspective, I thought that the common law would apply, and other than detention, the hospital would have to seek the consent of the patient, because committal, because you're a safety risk and suffering from mental disorder, doesn't necessarily mean that you're not mentally capable of making a treatment decision. So the Mental Health Act, in fact, changed many things, but was not perceived by many as making much change, other than going from 2 doctors to 1, and instead of indefinite confinement, a month, 2 months, 3 months of renewal based on similar criteria. Now I'm in the government and we're facing legal actions. It's 1977. There were habeas corpus actions, particularly out of the maximum secure mental hospital at Penetang, Oak Ridges, where historically many of the most violent offenders who were found not guilty by reason of insanity or unfit to stand trial would be kept. And I went up there with a young lawyer from the Attorney General's office and to deal with the habeas corpus. And on reviewing various notes, found practices like the use of LSD on some of these patients, many of whom were psychopaths, to try to change their behavior. They had a defense disruption technique using something called the capsule. There were a number of other adversive conditioning things used that were upsetting to someone who didn't understand fully what was happening. The minister of the day, a young minister named Dennis Timbrell, very upset by this, established a committee of psychiatrists, administrators, and the public trustee to look at reforming practices, policies, and develop new legislation. So in 1978, we developed a new Mental Health Act. There was great concern, particularly from the psychiatric profession at the time, because the committal criteria of safety risk were made much more precise. And there were due process hearings now. The review boards had to perform as administrative tribunals. We did provide for patients who were involuntary and refusing treatment a mechanism in the review board to provide what was known as treatment orders, where they could be compelled to take treatment. And we developed rules around confidentiality, privacy, which we saw as an emerging important issue, particularly in mental health. There was an attempt to articulate other provisions as well. There had been legal cases involved in nurses having to restrain patients to give them an injection to control violent behavior, and there were assault actions brought by those patients. And we thought it was important to put in definitions like restraint. I'm getting a little technical, but it's important because it's changed later on. We said that restraint was to keep a patient under control to prevent their acting out. In later amendments to the Mental Health Act, we had to change that to place under control, because the argument in courts that was being made by rights groups was that there was an attempt to use treatment modalities under the guise of restraint without consent. And there were also quite a few provisions put in at the request of the police. Police might pick up an offender who is acting out in the community and who would appear to be, to the police officers, quite mentally ill. And rather than taking them to jail, they were attempting to make a decision to divert them to a hospital. But often the police would bring them to the hospital and would be told that they had to stay until an assessment was done, which could be many hours when they were off the street. So they requested provisions that would allow them to remain at the hospital and create a duty of that sort. There are also provisions added to the legislation specifically that said where the police had reason to believe that an individual was suffering from a mental disorder and was acting out and could be potentially a danger to themselves or others, they could take them directly to a place to be assessed where a Form 1 or a committal form could be placed on the individual. So these provisions were put in, were enacted, and came into force in 1978. And along with them, the Ministry of Health took on a very great effort to produce information for the general public, a booklet called Rights and Responsibilities, but also a police guide to the Mental Health Act, a physician's guide, many different publications, roundtables, town hall meetings, and so on. In the early 80s as well, coterminous with the provincial effort, the federal government took on a project to amend the criminal code. And the laws on insanity and competency were changed to a large extent to come into line with what the provincial government had done as well. The review board was set up, so we have in Ontario a review board looking at criminal findings of a verdict of the accused committed the act but is not responsible because of mental disorder, the insanity language is gone, and other kinds of diversion provisions that exist. Also in the early 80s, a committee was established to look at new laws on mental capacity, consent, and advocacy. As a result of that, statutes like the Substitute Decisions Act, which is guardianship laws, the Healthcare Consent Act, Advocacy Act, and so on were developed. And on another matter of also importance is in the late 70s, there was a tragedy with a young woman who was severely mentally ill and had been moved around the system, who hung herself in jail. And there was an inquest, and the decision was made to develop children's mental health under one ministry, the Ministry of Community and Social Services. Subsequently, a children's ministry was created, but new laws were developed at that time that were based on a different philosophy than clinical care, more of a legal model with different provisions in something called the Child and Family Service Act that in fact conflicted with the Mental Health Act. So for young people, you had one set of rules, and then as people got older in 16, 17 into the teen years, you had the Mental Health Act. So there now was an emergence of some confusion around the laws that applied. There was a great concern around new groups that had developed, like the Ontario Friends of Schizophrenics family and friends with schizophrenic relatives who were very concerned that their relatives could not be admitted and treated easily to hospital. The beds were being decreased because of the use of drugs. You didn't need to keep people as long as before. And there were a number of other problems that came out that necessitated yet another change. Some of you may recall in 1999, 2000, a sportscaster in Ottawa was shot by someone who was alleged to be schizophrenic using a crossbow. He was killed. And his first name was Brian, and his widow was quite concerned. Many people were rallying around the need for new laws. So what was known as Brian's Law was developed, community treatment orders, where patients could remain in the community under supervision to ensure they stayed on their medication or discharged from hospital under the supervision of a physician. So this was part of the overall emergence of different laws, but policies also changed during this time. The 10 government mental hospitals were devolved to different mechanisms. Some of them merged, some of them developed their own boards. Queen Street Mental Health Center merged with the Clark Institute of Psychiatry and the Addiction Research Foundation to become KMH, pardon me. And we saw a different type of community involvement that today has emerged in the way where we have some very fine hospitals that are not directly run by government. Some bemoan the fact that that's not the case, because there was a feeling that when government actually ran and controlled these hospitals, there was always a safety net there. But I know that the people who are trying to do their best to run these other facilities have certainly created their own world. We don't have the large 10 government mental hospitals, but we have 4 or 5 centers of excellence that are trying to address many of today's problems. In 1988, the government asked a fellow by the name of Bob Graham to look at community mental health, which is, of course, a very significant problem, providing resources in the community to assist people and keep them out of hospital. And we were working at the time on a Community Mental Health Act, which did not quite make it into law, but the idea was that there would be some kind of legislative enabling authority that permitted the funding and accountability and quality oversight for community mental health programs. Many of these today are run by larger organizations such as KMH, and many are standalone and funded by organizations like the Canadian Mental Health Association, Ontario Division. So where are we now? Today, the government has many different departments and ministries with different forms of responsibility for mental health. I think there's 16 in all. There is a cabinet minister responsible for coordinating all of mental health, Michael Tobolo, who is a lawyer, an addiction counselor for many years, and about to get his PhD in clinical psychology. And he and his team work tirelessly on attempting to address many of these issues that we hear from the police, schizophrenic groups, the Ontario Psychiatric and Medical Association, families, psychiatric facilities, community agencies, and we're always reading things through the media. There are many different resources, particularly in the last few months, that the government has developed. Connex Ontario is one, the Youth Helpline is another, and if you were to look at the websites of the Ministry of Health and Mental Health and the Government of Ontario, much has been pledged to develop all kinds of linkages and provide online therapy, CBT and others. There are a number of resources now being put into play to try to assist, particularly now with the stresses and anxiety that we're seeing around the pandemic issues. I have, as a lawyer, I could, of course, speak forever. I have things I could say about our telehealth initiatives and other things, but I would like to stop here because I do want to provide opportunity for you to ask your questions. If we run out of questions, of course, I am always happy to continue talking, but we have a very eminent psychiatrist from Sunnybrook here on the line, who I'm sure has been waiting to ask a few questions of your own.
Okay, thanks, Gilbert, for that great talk. If anybody wants to ask a question, you'll see at the bottom of your screen there's a Q&A button. And if you can use that to type in a question if you want to ask Gilbert a question or even myself a question, and we'll do our best to answer them in whatever time we have. But I'm going to start off, Gilbert, by asking a couple of questions myself. And you had a nice review of the Mental Health Act and its kind of purposes, and discussed the balance between the individual rights versus the duty of care. And obviously, as a psychiatrist, I'd probably think of how the balance is going on one way, whereas some of the lawyers I come across in these review boards might see that the pendulum is on the other side of what they would like it to be. But what's your perception in terms of the balance between the rights of the individual and the duty of care that we're allowed to exercise as mental health professionals? Do you feel that we're at a right balance, or do you feel that there's some movement that needs to be done?
I don't, Cliff, I appreciate the question. I don't think there's ever a right balance. Having spent so many years in this area, first of all, we know that when it comes to funding the system within a hospital, so I mentioned public hospitals have psychiatric units. The administration of the hospital has to decide how to allocate scarce resources. And it was said to me many years ago by a deputy minister of health that we're in a very difficult area, that mental health is the orphan of the health system, that unfortunately, historically, it has not received the kind of attention or funding necessary, and that when I was in government, the arguments were made we should have protected funding envelopes for mental health as we do for emergency services and so on. So now I know the Ford government has been very vigilant in constantly announcing with Christine Elliott, the Minister of Health, and Michael Tobolo, more and more resources to go into this space and provide more opportunities for therapy. But again, when we're faced with a situation where coercion is essential, and really that's the question. So as a psychiatrist, if you were giving me instruction and you were in government now and telling me what to write, what language do I put on paper that deals with this balance? Remembering that in 1978, when we wrote these provisions, this was before we had a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. There are a number of Supreme Court of Canada cases now under the Charter that have struck down things like compulsory treatment. We had the ability through the review boards to force treatment on involuntary patients. That's gone. So even if we wanted to write language that there was a deemed incompetency when the patient was admitted as an involuntary patient, that could be challenged. Having said that, there are provinces like British Columbia that take that approach. So personally, I really can't answer a question of what the specific language should be and do we have it right or not right. But what I would like to see is an expansion of things like community treatment orders, where patients are brought to a point of medication so they can be stabilized and make their own independent judgments. We as individuals can make bad judgments as long as our ability to make those judgments, our reasoning capacity is intact. A doctor can tell me I need surgery to save my life. I can refuse the surgery. It may be a foolish decision, but I have a right to make it. At what point does society say that on account of mental illness, that right is taken away from an individual? And I find, having written much of this law over the years and studied laws internationally and had the opportunity to work with teams in other countries, there really, Cliff, there's no right and wrong answer here. It's a societal question. I'm sure none of us want to see a return to the days when we had backward patients of 1,000 plus, but we don't have the capacity or beds to do that anyway. And research now, as you know, is showing more and more some kind of genetic links for some forms of mental illness, which gives us hope that perhaps there'll be other medications that will be developed in time. Sorry, it's a very long answer. And as I said, I'm a lawyer. You know, you ask a question,
Yeah.
and unless someone jumps in, and I don't know if you're the moderator and
Yeah.
says stop, I'll continue on.
Yeah, yeah. You brought up like one of the issues that, like in this famous Starson case, where because of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that he wasn't able to be treated against his will, and at one point he was found capable, even though he was an involuntary patient, and he basically lingered on the ward for many years until they reestablished the finding of incapacity and did it in, let's say, a more proper way, if you want to put it that, so that the finding was upheld and they were able to treat him. But for years, because of how these rights and these differences between the Mental Health Act and the Healthcare Consent Act, that he basically stayed untreated for years, and that you kind of brought up that point.
Yeah, and was it eccentricity or mental disorder? I guess
he was seriously mentally ill.
Yes, yes.
But,
he had a good lawyer.
Yes, he had a good lawyer. Another question, you talk about some of the initiatives with Ford in terms of therapy and these sorts of things, but at the present time, if someone cannot afford therapy, they can only get it if they go to a physician. It's only covered by OHIP if you see a psychiatrist or a family doctor or some other physician. And that limits people that don't have means that could benefit from therapy, such as CBT that you mentioned. And what do you say about initiatives towards that sort of funding? Is that something that we can see on the horizon soon?
Yeah, it's my understanding that the current initiatives of the government are to fund a broad range of psychotherapists, psychologists, and social workers who will be trained in administering CBT, and that this will not be costing any of us anything, that the government is hoping to provide this access. What you're talking about, and I know that having been in government years ago, there was lobbying going on from, say, the psychologists to come under OHIP. And could you broaden the scope of government funding? We know that third-party pay for those that have it through their employment is limited in the number of sessions that they will cover. And this is a very serious issue of funding. It's not one I'm capable of responding to, but I know that Michael Tobolo and others are very concerned about, certainly at least now through this period of crisis of the pandemic, to ensure that funds are no barrier to access to mental health care.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to get to some of the questions from the attendees. Read the first one. Access to services has been a huge problem, especially for young people. University health services are overwhelmed and wait lists are endless. Do you see improvement in access for this population? Is it the job of the university or health services in the community?
Well, as I said, there is a young people's helpline available out there. I have not tried to access it. I'm told it's effective and it's being expanded. We have had opportunity to speak with President Gertner from the University of Toronto. Very great concerns. I know that he had mentioned they're putting access to therapists in many of the colleges and the libraries when the libraries were open, and that there are signs posted all over U of T. I can say this as a prof there, that you see them everywhere, that if you're in distress and you're feeling anxious, call this number. So again, I don't know the specifics. I'm not involved, but very well-meaning and well-intentioned and caring people that I've met, certainly at the University of Toronto, are doing their best to provide the services, and I believe that there is funding available for this.
Yeah, I'm just going to add something to the answer that for people that live in the GTA, there is a service from Sunnybrook for patients aged 13 to 26 called the Family Navigation Project. And you call a family navigator and they will help you navigate the system and find help in your area based on where you live and what the specific issue your child has. So just wanted to add that to the response. Just
There
go
are
on to the
also,
next.
I believe that there are also an expansion going on of mobile crisis units. And I know that when I was doing work years ago with Youthdale Treatment Center, you know, they had as well mobile units that would go out and deal with family situations with young people in trouble and in crisis.
Okay. The next question, thank you, Gilbert, is somebody wanted to ask how you became involved in mental health law for the provincial government.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I was happily teaching law at the time. I developed courses in health law and law and mental health, and was asked to look at issues relating to the Mental Health Act, and you know, would I consider coming in for a while on a contract to do a review? Often professors are brought in to look at specific issues, and this was something, since I was teaching in the space, that I was very interested in. And then I think I gave a bit of my history going back to '75 and connecting with the CEOs. When I came in, actually, the system had just changed. Medical superintendents ran psychiatric hospitals, so they were psychiatrists, and they weren't the administrative model that we have, you know, the professional administrator or CEO, although that did change in time. And when I came in, there were regular meetings every month with the dozen or so medical directors and CEOs, and there was a psychiatric branch in the Ministry of Health, very well coordinated. And my initial job offer was, why don't you stay around and deal with all of the psych hospitals and all of our mental health issues, so that I would, like you, a doctor, I'd be on call, you know, taking calls from emerges and so on, which I found fascinating. And I stayed and wrote some books and got more involved in the space, and have really enjoyed the involvement with government. It's an exciting place to be in. If you think about it, as a lawyer, writing the words that become law in so many areas of healthcare, which I had the privilege to do for many years, is fascinating. I don't think as a lawyer there's many more challenges that are as important.
Okay, there was a question here about the mental health issues related to COVID, what the government is doing. I know, you know, personally, it's been a challenge. You know, some of my patients don't have access to video conferencing, and I'm dealing a lot of it on the phone. And there's certain patients that can't access care because of COVID. They can't get to the hospital, or don't even want to come to the hospital, and then their situation deteriorates. So can you speak to this issue of COVID-19 and what's happening and what the government is doing about it in terms of mental health care?
Well, again, I would go back to my initial comment about Connect Ontario. I think if you, and I am not a technology person, I don't even own a computer, but I know that seems incredible, but if I didn't have the support of people here at the Shul, this would be a hopeless endeavor. But I know that there are many in the Ontario government working on developing all kinds of online resources. And if there isn't the ability to communicate in this fashion, there are alternatives. But Connect Ontario, I think, is the one, and I can provide anyone who's interested with a list of services. This isn't a one shot, as I said, 1 hour and I'm gone. I'm happy to research this and provide information if anyone would like to have the feedback through whatever mechanism seems most appropriate.
Okay, thank you. There was a question about protection of services or services for older adults. I think not only those with dementia, but there are older adults that have aged with mental illness throughout their lives. And what are your thoughts about how we can support those people, both in the community and in long-term care?
I know now we see pictures in the paper every day about the isolation of the elderly from their families and the special risks that attach with COVID. Generally speaking, this will pass in time. We know that and we pray for it. But the greater problem of dealing with people who become a little slower, whether it is dementia or anything else that requires support. I think at either end of the spectrum, whether it's young people or the elderly, I do hear conversations regularly in government about providing supports. Excuse me. The services available in the community, the services being funded by the government, services through places like Baycrest and other facilities that specialize in this type of care, preferably in the community, preferably allowing people as long as possible to remain in their homes and not feel isolated and lonely. As I say, I think today, hopefully this is transitional, and it's a very, very difficult time for the elderly. And those particularly without family support. But I know that there's so many agencies and so many opportunities being opened up by government to provide that care. I have no easy answer. You know, you're a psychiatrist, I'm sure. I know Sunnybrook, I've spoken historically many times in the Department of Psychiatry there, like so many of our other centers, public hospitals and specialist hospitals. So many of you are involved with the elderly in trying to find ways of communicating and letting them feel that they do have access to the care that they need. Okay. It's difficult with the PSW populations now being limited and the worry that everyone has about the elderly and particularly catching this virus. As I say, these are very special, unique times right now, but it's a broader issue that transcends the passage of this virus that we must be very mindful of course.
Yeah. Paradoxically, it seems that some of the seniors, they're kind of isolated to begin with, so there hasn't been much change in their life. But a big issue is the fact that their support systems such as PSWs can't really get to them as frequently as they have in the past, and that's been a big stress.
Yes.
Moving on to the next question, could you summarize what legislation guides police response to calls regarding mental health distress of themselves or others?
Yes, the way in which things will work with the police, and there are these special units now that have been developed with healthcare professionals that can support and assist the police, but the police will be reluctant to bring them in initially if they get a call that there is a weapons issue or violence. They're not going to bring healthcare professionals initially into that. They will investigate. Having taught many years ago at the police college at Elmer, there are training programs in mental health that used to be done, and I'm sure that still continue with the police. But as I say, the provisions that we wrote and that we updated and that we've monitored do allow the police to come onto a scene, observe someone who appears to be mentally ill. And studies were done over the years about the number of people determined by the police to be mentally ill and taken to a hospital and those admitted. And the study concluded that the police have, on the whole, a very good ability to judge someone who is in need of that kind of care. So they do have the ability to take someone directly to a hospital for assessment and possible admission to the facility where they can get care. You know, there are challenges in getting this kind of care in a jail. We know that. Although there are specialized jails like OCI that will focus on mental health for inmates, at the initial apprehension stage, it's very important to give the police the ability to divert where they can.
Yeah, I've read that up to a third of police calls involve mental health situations. And just to elaborate a bit more, that the criteria for the police to apprehend someone and bring them to hospital or assessment are pretty much the same as what a doctor would use to commit a patient, such as the basically harm to self or others, and the suspicion that it's related to a mental illness.
Yeah, but I should say that the language is important again. I know the devil is always in the details, but the language is apparently suffering from a mental disorder rather than they are suffering. That's the diagnosis that must be made once they're in hospital for the renewal of a certificate, as you know. So the idea of the impression that they're ill to allow them to divert and get the person to an expert who will make that evaluation and judgment on whether they need admission or to be committed to the facility.
Okay. Next question is, somebody asked, is CBT a community-based treatment? Yes, it is, but Gilbert, if you want to talk more about that.
I'm not going to pretend to be a psychiatrist any more than you've tried to be a lawyer. So although the lines do mix occasionally, I do understand that. But I will leave the whole idea of DBT and CBT and what treatments are effective for what conditions to your expertise, doctor.
Yeah, well, so, CBT is essentially meant to be a community treatment. It stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. And the reason it should be a community-based treatment is that you're trying to develop skills in the way you approach or think about a situation or deal with it, from both the way you think about the situation or the way you react, to basically live your life in a better way and make better decisions to reduce your anxiety or feelings of depression. So the best way to do that would be in vivo, so like in your daily life, to have a situation of concern that would lead you to have these sort of symptoms of depression, anxiety, and approach it in a different way so that you can improve your mental health. Next question. How can high school teachers help our students who are dealing with anxiety disorders, which seems to be growing and growing every year?
Well, again, I have to put that back to you. I think as a psychiatrist and a therapist, I'm assuming that there, again, would be the availability of programs to train and teach and sensitize teachers that I know the Ministry of Education historically has had funding from the Ministry of Health to provide for special needs in the classroom. And again, I would think that there would be all kinds of programs available through the school boards, the municipalities, and through the government. I don't know specifically, I'm not in that space.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. Is there an expectation that OHIP will continue to fund distance therapy, which many are finding effective, after the COVID crisis is behind us? I hope you have an answer for that one, because I know from my experience with this happened during SARS and the H1N1, is that as soon as the crisis was over, that a lot of these distance therapy options were no longer funded, specifically phone calls. Having said that, there is a telepsychiatry option or a telehealth option that is fully funded, and that's available even outside of crises, and that's called OTN, Ontario Telehealth Network. Not every physician has access to it, and from my end, a lot of my patients don't have access to it. But wondering, Gilbert, if you have an answer to how long this funding will continue for these distance therapy.
I'm sorry, I don't. I don't make those decisions, and I don't sit in rooms with those who do. But I know that we're all becoming accustomed to working long distance, and telehealth is becoming much more important. Dealing with organizations that specialize. I was there when the OTN was set up. It's expanded its reach greatly, of course, and we've become reliant on that and other telehealth mechanisms that are out there. And I've found this very useful. And I know that there's talk about even the work from home with a lot of the large employers saying, this may become somewhat of the norm because it seems to work well for many people and the productivity is there. So certainly it's been of great benefit. And it's being expanded now, but whether as a matter of policy, the government will decide down the road to continue it or expand it, I don't know. I think we're all in the same position, and I'm not even sure that the government has come close to making those decisions. I think right now, the government's putting all their energy into just trying to deal with the here and now pressures and crisis by expanding that kind of access to ensure that you as a psychiatrist and other therapists are at the end of a phone or a screen or whatever mechanism people can access out in the community.
Okay. Next question. Thank you for that. Next question. Are they hiring additional staff to handle the increased need for services during the pandemic? How are they paying for the increased use of the services?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I don't have all the answers, but I'm not sure what kind of services they're talking about. If it's mental health services, again, I know that a great deal of money is being allocated proportionately to mental health. To healthcare generally, of course, with the so many challenges that we're facing, but certainly to mental health in particular, because I see this through Michael Tobolo and the day-to-day conversations that are had, and he is a very significant advocate for just that point. And it falls on welcome ears with the Premier and with the Health Minister. I've seen that as well. The numbers, I don't know. The extent to which people are, being brought on to deal with this. As I said, there is an expansion of the role of psychotherapists to assist people from a long distance where appropriate and necessary, of all ages and in all languages. Yeah. So that is a good thing. And I guess, we're dealing with things day to day. I actually have come to look forward to the Premier's 1 o'clock talks where, he speaks from the heart and just says, this is what we've got in our hands and this is what I'm trying to do. And mental health is there. I think you see the Minister of Health at his side most days.
Well, I do hope that the funding continues specifically for the distance therapy. Some of my adolescent colleagues, adolescent psychiatry colleagues, talk about how they've actually had less no-shows because some of these adolescent patients didn't want to come to the office or weren't as keen to keep their appointments. But if they're doing it by Zoom or telehealth or whatever, and they can just be in their room, that they seem to be more willing to come to the session. So hopefully that will continue.
Well, to me, a therapy session is a therapy session. And it's the interaction one-on-one that's important. And if it can be facilitated, I'm happy to hear that adolescent patients are being more vigilant in attending their sessions in this forum. And I guess it's because the youth, unlike me, are accustomed to, well, first of all, owning a computer and then doing things with it. So if that is the mechanism of the future that's going to assist in greater access for therapy, that's very important.
Okay, I'm going to read the next question. I am worried about what's going to happen to the very young children when some of the restrictions are lifted. They've been isolated from their extended family and friends. I really don't think they understand. My granddaughter says, "Bubby, I can't come to your house until the virus is over." How sad is that? That's a difficult question.
Well, we could both deal with it, I suppose. I can give you an example from the apartment building that I live in, which is dog friendly, and I have a dog. So the other day I was out walking the dog and I came back in through the entrance and there was a young person with a dog with a mask on coming the other way. I stepped back, of course, to give proper distancing, but the dogs, being dogs, were sniffing each other. And this young person stepped back in horror. It was fear, not anger, saying, "Please pull your dog back. I can get the virus from your dog." And which I did. Of course, I brought the dog back out of respect. But afterwards, I was taken by the concern that perhaps there are a number of young people that have not really experienced yet in their lives a very serious challenge, like certainly not like what we're having now. And I think your observation, doctor, was a very good one, that in a way, the elderly, where you would think that we would be more concerned because we're more susceptible to serious consequences from the virus, would be more worried. But it seems the young people are demonstrating such great signs of fear and anxiety and stress and an unwillingness to come out even when things are starting to gradually open up. I know from my own building, talking to parents saying that their young kids, they won't come out. They are afraid. And until there's a vaccine, they wouldn't even consider it. I don't know. What is a psychiatrist? What do you do with that? What do you do with the fear?
That is not an easy question, because it's hard to balance doing the right thing and making sure you protect yourself versus what's a reasonable fear and overcoming that. And it's difficult to know like how to strike that balance when this is something that we haven't encountered in our lives before. There may be a few people that are still with us from the Spanish flu in 1918, but not too many that can give us some guidance in how to cope with such a devastating pandemic. And people are just trying to do the best they can. And I guess trying to do some little things, like maybe you can't go to Bubby's house, but maybe you could meet her in a park or go outside and see her at a distance somewhere, so at least you can spend some time with her, just to feel some sense of normalcy and do what you can to try to do something that makes things feel somewhat normal. I try to encourage my patients to go out for a walk every day, and while of course reminding them to either wear a mask or if they can't keep their distance, or to keep their distance, because the importance of trying to maintain some routine and some normalcy. Next question, how would the government be able to include mental health parity and equity into the Mental Health Act?
I don't know what that means.
Yeah, I guess it means probably equal access, that people with limited means wouldn't be shut out. And I think what we spoke about before in terms of funding of therapy by the government, so that somebody who can't afford a psychologist or a social worker would be able to access care. I think that would be an important initiative to help with that.
But there is, of course, equal access to physicians, to psychiatrists. I realize it may not be, easy, that you have wait lists, but certainly tax dollars pay your fees. It's under OHIP, it's insured. And, Canada, of course, as Canadians, we're all very proud of the Canada Health Act and the fact that healthcare is covered. So I don't see it as an inequity. Although, as I say, right now, there's a very great need for increased access, and the government, the money that they're putting forward is intended to provide equity for that as well, whether it's CBT or other forms of access through telehealth or other means. There's no expectation, there's no means test, there's no expectation that people should have to pay for this. This is money being put on the table to help as many people as possible.
Just like a related question, is there something we could change in the mental health legislation that could create more consistent experience for people needing access to services?
Well, again, I do think that we have looked at this historically. It's a good question. We have looked at issues around a Community Mental Health Act and how we could set up legislation that drives funding mechanisms for different kinds of services while providing accountability and quality with an oversight, whether it's done by Ontario Health, our new super agency, or through another mechanism, through the hospitals like KMH or others. But that is something we could look at. The Mental Health Act is not a funding act. It's an act that deals with a balance of rights and responsibilities, as we've just discussed, Doctor. But there is a way of creating those mechanisms, yes.
Okay. Next question actually comes from a physician, because I recognize the name, but I'm not going to say who it is. Is limiting the number of OHIP-covered psychotherapy sessions per person per year still being discussed by the government, or have they dropped that proposal?
That's a good question. I don't know. I'm not directly involved in that. I have heard that the matter had come out of some joint committee of the OMA and the Ministry of Health, and I've certainly, heard the concerns raised, as have the ministers of health and mental health from the Ontario Psychiatric Association and others. I don't believe any decision has been made, but certainly I'm not privy to that. So I wish I could provide an answer, but I can't.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. But I guess the main issue with that is access, like access for the individual patient to get the amount of psychotherapy that their doctor feels they need, versus limiting that so that other patients can access that psychotherapy. So that's the challenge that is at the crux of that proposed
I
legislation.
understand the issue.
Okay. Okay, so I don't think there are any more questions. So Gilbert, I'd like to thank you for your time tonight, for going over the history of the Mental Health Act and how we got here from there, for your insightful comments about mental health policy and your experience as a lawyer and working with the government, and your response to some of these challenging questions from the members. And I thank you also for making yourself available in the future to provide some more answers to our members as in the future. So
Well,
thank you very much.
As I said, I'm very grateful, Cliff, for the opportunity to come to Adath Israel, to to hear from the rabbi, from yourself, from our executive director. And I'm hoping that many of the people who have been online for this presentation will feel that they can follow up with me. And I do hope to meet many of them in shul. So thank you.
Thank
And
you
if I
very
may,
much.
Cliff, on that note, I'm going to be sending a note out tomorrow to all those who attended tonight. And what we'll do is we'll talk about future opportunities to interact and engage with Gilbert. So if you do have specific questions, then you can pose them at that time, either through a forum like this or through another mechanism, to use your words, Gilbert.
Yeah, for sure, Phil. Happy to do it.
Great. Thanks everyone very much for coming, and stay tuned in our Oxshovs. They come out every Monday and Thursday, and we'll advise what the next programs are as soon as possible. Thank you very much and have a great night. Thank you so much, Gilbert.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.